A flash of injustice. Dawn's pale light slices through courthouse blinds as a uniformed officer grips his flashlight like a weapon. He's pulled a black man from his car for no more reason than the color of his skin, a quiet morning shattered by suspicion. In the harsh glare, the man's tailored suit seems incongruous, a lawyer on his way to work now trembling under a gaze forged in bias. Metal cuffs click shut around his wrists. The hallway echoes with hurried footsteps and startled murmurs. One wrong look, one unchecked prejudice thrusts this man into a violent ritual of humiliation. Comment below where you're watching from, hit subscribe and follow for the next chapters as this story unfolds. Morning light fractures through the courthouse windows, casting long, fractured lines across the polished floor. The hush is absolute until Officer Jackson Ballard steps into the chamber, his uniform crisp and his jaw set like granite. In his gloved hand, he clutches a single pair of handcuffs, clicking them closed around the wrists of the man before him. Marcus Hayes stands motionless, shoulders back, eyes level, as though he has rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. His charcoal suit is immaculate, the crease of his trousers sharp, his polished Oxfords gleaming under the unforgiving fluorescence. But despite the tailored perfection, exhaustion circles his eyes in dark rings. He says nothing. He pleads no defense. The judge presides from the bench above the gavel, suspended in midair as though time itself has caught its breath. Around them, the court staff and a handful of onlookers lean forward, drawn by the unspoken tension. Ballard sweeps his flashlight across Hayes's face, illuminating half in stark white, half in yawning shadow. Dust motes hang like silent witnesses in the beam. A single streak of dried blood mars Hayes's cheek, a relic of last night's arrest when 2 patrolmen dragged him from his car on suspicion of some unspecified suspicious behavior. Hayes's only offense, driving through the wrong neighborhood at the wrong hour, his presence enough to trigger instinctive fear. A scene born of bias and untested assumptions repeated in thousands of towns across the country. No lawyer stands at his side to whisper last-minute counsel. No family member waits in the gallery ready to vouch for his character. Hayes could be anyone until in one deliberate motion he reaches into the inner pocket of his jacket. There is no flourish, no dramatic flourish, only the quiet click of metal against fabric. He withdraws a silver badge, flipping it in Ballard's flashlight beam. Director, Federal Investigations. Hayes says, his voice measured, controlled. The words crack the silence like a gunshot. In one gesture, he has upended every expectation in the room. Ballard's face pales, his rigid posture slackening for the first time. The judge blinks, dislodging the gavel, which thunks softly back onto the bench. Court reporters freeze, fingers poised over keys. Onlookers exchange astonished glances. The man they assumed was a criminal, another faceless statistic, has just revealed himself as the highest authority in the very system they serve. Hayes lets the badge hang between them, its polished surface reflecting the pale dawn. A flicker of something passes over his face, relief, regret, resolve. And then he retucks it into his pocket. The handcuffs, once an emblem of suspicion, clatter in Ballard's grip as the officer hesitates, uncertain whether to obey the warrant in his hand or to kneel and apologize. Neither man moves. The courtroom holds its breath. In that pregnant moment, the weight of every unchallenged bias, every unexamined assumption settles like dust in the air. The routine stop has shattered. The script has dissolved. What remains is raw reckoning. Outside, the city stirs. The morning sun, once gentle, now seems harsh, forcing every witness to confront the reality they almost overlooked. In the hush, Hayes's presence is a mirror held up to their collective conscience. His silence is not submission. It is challenge. The next breath everyone takes will mark the beginning of a new trial, one that goes far beyond the limits of the law. It is a trial of conscience, of community, of an institution at the brink of transformation. And it all began in that courthouse chamber at dawn's first light, with a man who refused to be seen only through the lens of fear. The courtroom's hush fractures into jeers the moment Officer Ballard steps back. Jaw slack, his authority momentarily undone. Patrolmen huddle near the back benches, leather gloves tapping knees in cadence as one of them. Officer Turner leans forward and whispers loud enough for half the room to hear, "Check out the stiff suit Ballard guy's packing, more than confidence under that tie." A ripple of laughter spreads low at first, then swelling like a wave crashing onto stone. Hayes sits unmoving on the bench, hands folded in his lap. His gaze is fixed straight ahead, lips pressed into a line of quiet defiance. The flash of that silver badge still glints against the polished wood of his jacket. He makes no attempt to reclaim it, no meek apology, nothing to soften the insult. His silence is a mirror. Every mocking snicker, every contemptuous smirk passes right back onto the perpetrators. A court clerk, her name tag reads Martin, perches at the edge of the front row. She angles her phone screen so she can film Hayes' unmoved profile and the officer's eager grins. "This is gold," she murmurs, her voice thick with glee. "You think he'll break?" Her question dissolves into giggles as she pans across the bench to Turner, whose smirk broadens. From somewhere to the side, a child's voice cuts in high and clear. "Is he bad, Mommy?" The mother's cheeks flush as she pulls her daughter closer, whispering hurried reassurances. But the question hangs in the air, a stone tossed into still water. A beat later, it is swallowed by fresh laughter from the officers. "Bad guy kiddo," Turner says with relish, voice lilting. "That's just how crooks dress on their day off." Around them, the room brims with low murmurs. Some jurors glance at Hayes with curiosity, others with indignation. A few onlookers, business people, students. A nurse in scrubs exchange uneasy looks as though they've caught themselves chuckling at something they shouldn't. The wooden benches that bear witness to solemn oaths now reverberate with derision. Hayes' chest rises and falls in a measured rhythm. He does not wince when Turner leans in, eyes glittering, daring him to react. He does not shift when Martin's camera phone inches closer. He does not flinch when the child tugs at her mother's sleeve. Again, voice quivering. "Mom, why is he quiet?" In that stillness, something uncanny settles over the room. The air, once merely stale with too many bodies. In an overheated chamber now feels charged like the moment before lightning strikes. A court reporter tentatively lifts her pen poised over the notebook, as if afraid to disturb the tableau. Even the judge leans forward, brows knitted, the gavel's weight suddenly irrelevant. Hayes' mind drifts not to anger or fear, but to the countless stories he's heard black men frisked in their own neighborhoods dismissed as suspects until proven otherwise. He recalls the tremor of indignation when he first felt those steel cuffs around his wrists, the jolt of shame at every side glance. And yet here he sits, refusing to collapse under the weight of their projection. His silence is neither defiance nor submission. It is assertion. It says without a single syllable, "I am not who you presume." Officer Turner straightens, clearing his throat before addressing the judge. "Your Honor, I move that we continue with the formal reading of charges. I believe Mr. Hayes has something to say for himself." His tone is mocking, but his hand trembles slightly as it hovers over the docket. The judge taps the gavel twice, a soft knock, as if testing the solidity of the wooden block. "Proceed," he says, voice low. Turner takes a breath. "Mr. Hayes, would you like to speak before the charges are read?" Hayes lifts his head, for the first time eyes meeting the judge's. There is no plea to be heard, no confession, no demand to be released. Just a cool, unwavering stare that makes every heart in the room skip. A single nod follows, slow, deliberate. It hangs in that perfumed silence like a question mark that demands an answer from all who hear it. How does one speak truth when the world insists on lies? Murmurs flutter among the officers. They had expected groveling, or at best a politely sarcastic admission of some petty wrongdoing. They certainly hadn't anticipated this unspoken challenge, this silent command to rethink every assumption they'd ever held. Martin's camera remains trained on Hayes, but her fingers falter on the screen. Turner's smirk curdles into uncertainty. The laughter which had swelled so confidently fades into a choked echo. Even the child's mother falls silent, her daughter's question now too pointed to answer. It is in that moment between the hush of anticipation and the gathering gloom of doubt that the real drama unfolds. More potent than any shouted verdict, more powerful than any legal ruling is the collective shift in the room's atmosphere. The mockery sputters to a halt as each person feels the weight of having judged without knowing, of having laughed at a faceless stereotype. Hayes's silence stretches longer, and a strange gravity draws all eyes back to him. The crack in the courtroom's moral floor widens, not from the man's guilt, but from the grown-ups' complicity in their own prejudices. They had thought their laughter harmless, their jokes inconsequential. Now confronted with a man who refuses to perform guilt on demand, they are forced to confront the echo of their own doubt. In a courtroom, the word guilty is pronounced with ceremony and structure. But here in this second part of the trial, guilt takes a different form, the guilt of knowing you have misjudged, the guilt of having weaponized assumptions, the guilt of letting bias masquerade as authority. Hayes remains seated, the silver badge hidden once more beneath his jacket. Yet its presence lingers in every shifting glance, every faltering laugh. And as the gavel's echo finally rolls through the chamber, barely audible, as if afraid to break the spell, everyone realizes that the true reckoning has only just begun. They will remember this. And they will never laugh so easily at a stranger again. A thin slice of afternoon sun glints off the cracked pavement as Marcus Hayes steps into the wide-open plaza beyond the courthouse steps. His lips press into a straight line, jaw tight, as his steel-gray eyes scan the gathering crowd. At first, it's just a trickle of curious onlookers, smartphones held aloft, screens alight. But within seconds, that trickle becomes a flood. Someone's already live-streaming. The blue live badge pulses in the corner of a phone screen. A high-pitched alert rings out from another device. Someone's posted the footage to TikTok, and the views are climbing by the hundreds. Hayes walks slowly, measured, each step deliberate, as though he's pacing into a closing scene of a thriller. The camera lens captures his every move, the crisp line of his jacket, the faint sheen of sweat at his temples, the faded bloodstain at his collar. A mashed-up rap beat blares from one phone's speakers, synced so perfectly with his gait that it looks like choreographed art. The hashtag #SilentThug pops up in an animated overlay, bold white letters pulsing to the rhythm. A teenage boy waves his phone like a victory flag. "Yo, this is gold!" He shouts, the rap track booming. He ain't said a word. A ripple of laughter breaks out among his friends who circle around him hunched over their screens. They replay the clip in slow motion, Hayes's shoulders rising and falling in that controlled rhythm and overlay text. "When you walk like a boss but got no proof." Hayes's chest tightens as if the onlooker's amusement has weight. He glances up at the courthouse facade, its columns stoic and unblinking. In that moment, he feels every pair of eyes tracing his form, every sneer reflected in the flickering screens. He does not flinch. He keeps walking. Down the street, a local news van barrels to a stop, tires skidding against asphalt. The back hatch flips open, and a cameraman hauls out a shoulder rig before darting forward. The reporter, blonde hair swept into a no-nonsense ponytail, shoves a microphone toward Hayes as he nears the barricade. "Sir, are you the man they're calling the silent thug?" she demands, voice clipped. Hayes stops, gaze unwavering. He leans in, allowing the microphone's foam windscreen to frame his lower face. But the question hangs in the air like an echo. He offers no answer. The camera's red tally light continues blinking, hungry for sound. The reporter cues him again. "Why won't you speak?" He straightens. His voice, when it comes, is low enough that only those nearest the mic can hear. "I'm not the one who walked into judgment without evidence," he says. The reporter's eyes widen just for a moment before she bobs her head and pivots to the live camera. "There you have it, folks," she says to the lens. Our #SilentThug declares his silence a protest. Back on social media, the clip explodes. Shares cascade into the millions. Retweets swarm in a torrent. One trending topic is #justice, or joke, as commentators debate whether Hayes's refusal to speak is dignity or defiance. Another goes by #badge or bail, questioning whether the man's badge should grant him instant release or deeper scrutiny. A self-styled meme lord overlays Hayes's image with a clown nose and calls it "The Courtroom Clown Returns." The filtered GIF cycles on loop, drawing thousands of likes within minutes. Across platforms, reaction videos sprout users filming their own faces as they watch the clip, eyebrows raising, mouths agape. Some jeer, some smirk. A surprising number flinch when the camera pans upward to reveal Hayes's unwavering eyes. On the evening news, a primetime anchor shuffles papers trying to maintain gravitas. Tonight, an unprecedented scene: a man calmly brandishes a federal badge in open court after being mocked by officers, she intones. The screen behind her shows split images: on one side, Hayes' silent strut; on the other, the laughing officers. Is this the face of authority or the face of someone above the law? The next morning, Hayes' phone buzzes with unread notifications, hashtags, mentions, angry emojis, supportive messages, viral reaction clips. He scrolls through a sea of comments, his thumb hovering over replies he never typed. There's an undercurrent of something darker, threats masked as jokes. Racial slurs slipped into harmless banter calls for his prosecution. Yet, interspersed among the bile are unexpected voices of conscience. A former police officer laments, "I laughed at that. Now I feel sick." A college professor writes, "This silent protest speaks more than any speech." A mother posts, "My son asked me why people laugh at a man who hasn't harmed anyone. I had no answer." Hayes sets his phone down, breathing deeply. He thinks back to the moment the laughter started, how easily it had rolled through the courtroom like a contagious disease. He recalls the perverse thrill officers took as they orbited him, convinced of his guilt because of the mere fact of his presence. Outside the courthouse, the plaza is now a hive of activity. Protesters hold signs: "Justice, not jokes." "See the badge, see the person." Silence is not a crime. Counter-protesters stand a few yards away, brandishing banners mocking Hayes' stoic routine. Police barricades divide the square, a stark line between anger and amusement. Hayes slips through a side gate, accompanied by a small entourage of journalists and legal aides. He doesn't raise a hand to wave. He doesn't clench his fists. His silence remains intact, a living rebuke to every jeer and gif. In a nearby cafe, two college students huddle over their laptops watching live streams. One shakes her head. "I feel guilty for clicking play," she admits. The other nods, brow furrowed. They say we're just entertainment, but it's people's reputations being toyed with. Down the block, an elderly man sits on a bench watching the digital frenzy unfold on his tablet. He sighs and taps his cane twice on the ground, tapping out a slow rhythm of disapproval. "We used to see the badge and feel safe," he mutters. "Now all it brings is spectacle." By dusk, the viral outrage has metastasized into something more introspective. Opinion pieces appear: silent resistance when saying nothing speaks volumes. From mockery to accountability. The viral age's new morality. Are we the jury or the jester? Talk shows. Dedicate entire segments to Hayes' unspoken message: the danger of judging without evidence, the cost of laughter at another's expense. Back in his apartment, Hayes stands by his window overlooking the city lights. The glow of his phone screen flickers against the glass as he watches a compilation video titled "From Arrest to Icon: The Silent Thug's Unlikely Rise." The final frame freezes on his badge and the words, "Who is this man?" Pulse in red, jolting like a warning. He closes his eyes and thinks of the judge's chamber, the hush that followed his nod before charges were read, the collective discomfort that settled like dust. He thinks of every laugh that crackled through the air, every finger that tapped share, every viewer who thought they were mere spectators. His silence has become a mirror not just for the officers, but for an entire society mesmerized by quick judgments and viral sensations. He realizes that the real reckoning isn't in the courtroom. Now it's unfolding in living rooms, newsrooms, and the glowing palms of smartphones around the world. And as he turns away from the window, Hayes knows this chapter is far from over. The outrage may burn bright tonight, but tomorrow, when the hashtags fade and the memes morph into memory, people will still be left with a question that transcends any punchline. What did they learn about themselves in the face of his silence? They can't click like on that. They're going to have to answer it themselves. Lieutenant Rachel Monroe's heels clicked against the glossy floor tiles as she strode through the precinct's cavernous foyer, ID badge swinging at her chest. The morning sun slanted through high windows, carving the lobby into sharp-edged triangles of light and shadow, an apt metaphor, she thought, for the fractures now running through her unit. Word of Marcus Hayes' silent rebuke had spread faster than any radio dispatch. and Monroe was determined to contain the damage before it became uncontainable. By mid-morning, the briefing room was crowded with staffers and supervisors, eyes flicking nervously to the closed double doors before Monroe finally entered. She offered no pleasantries, there was none to spare. "We've got questions pouring in from City Hall, from community groups, hell, from within our own ranks," she began, voice low and insistent. "Our job today is to start answering them. First order of business. How do we preserve public trust when we look like we've abandoned our own procedures?" The question hung in the stale air like a challenge. An analyst handed out crisply formatted memos, two-page prints headlined, "Review stops and frisks last 6 months." Monroe scanned the first sheet. There it was, dozens of cases flagged as insufficient cause, officers marking unknown individual or citing furtive movements without specifics. She felt a pit open in her stomach. They had spent years preaching probable cause, but apparently when convenience called shortcuts were taken. "Who saw this before it went to print?" Monroe asked, jabbing a finger at the document. No one volunteered. She leaned forward until her eyes were level with the table. "If you didn't know we were cutting corners," she said, "why didn't you try to know? If you did and said nothing, why are you still on this team?" Silence answered her. Not the respectful hush of attention, but the cold quiet of people afraid to speak. Monroe let it stand for a heartbeat before continuing. "All squad leaders are to conduct immediate reviews of your officers' stop reports. I want a summary on my desk by end of day. No excuses." She dismissed them with a curt nod and retreated into her office where two policy analysts hunched over laptops typing frantically. Their screens scrolled through internal emails. "We need a unified message. Act now to mitigate reputation damage." As Monroe closed the door behind her, she let her shoulders slump against it, rubbing her temples. The frantic tapping of keys echoed in the cramped space, each click a reminder that the precinct's armor had been pierced. Across the hall, Officer Miguel Santos clicked through the same audit report on his desktop. He'd joined the force with starry-eyed devotion, believing in the oath to serve and protect. Now he read entry after entry, where fellow officers, people he'd gone on midnight patrols with, stopped citizens on a hunch, logged no follow-up, and moved on. He swallowed hard, glancing at the photo pinned above his computer, him and his daughter smiling at a Little League game. What had he been teaching her about fairness? Downstairs, Detective Olivia Price felt the tremors of disarray in her own squad. Two of her best investigators argued over coffee. One insisted this was a witch hunt, that the public would never understand the split-second judgments required in the field. The other barked that maybe, just maybe, they'd gotten too trigger-happy. Their voices grew so loud that the barista from the kiosk peeked around the corner, eyebrows raised. Price stepped between them. "Keep it inside," she said quietly. "We're under the microscope now. If you can't talk it out, then don't talk at all." She caught each of their eyes, one bristling with anger, the other tinged with guilt, and let her expression convey the rest. They were on probation, every one of them. Back in Monroe's office, the lieutenant watched as her analyst drafted a memo for Chief Donovan outlining immediate action, suspension of stops lacking clear cause, mandatory retraining on implicit bias, and a community outreach plan featuring town halls and listening sessions. Monroe didn't believe check-the-box fixes would mend the rift, but they were a start. Her phone buzzed a text from the city's Public Integrity Commission. They wanted a face-to-face by tomorrow. Monroe's jaw clenched. She typed a curt reply. "Noted. Will accommodate." Then leaned back, exhaling slowly. Tomorrow meant another chess match with oversight bodies who smelled vulnerability. At lunchtime, the precinct cafeteria was subdued. The usual clamor of trays and laughter had been replaced by furtive glances and half-hearted murmurs. Sergeant Ahmed Patel sat alone at a corner table, scrolling through social feeds on his phone. He paused on a clip of Hayes returning to his car, framed by flashing police lights and chanting protesters. Patel's gaze lingered on Hayes' still face and the badge gleaming at his belt, and he felt for the first time a kinship with the very civilians his unit often distrusted. Nearby, two rookies whispered over a pizza slice. "We're going to be on YouTube forever," one muttered, eyes wide. His partner shrugged, trying to joke. "At least they'll see us in action." But neither met Patel's eyes when he walked past. They too, he realized, were questioning what they'd signed up for. By mid-afternoon, the precinct's slow bleed of unity had turned into an active hemorrhage. Officer Gail Monroe, no relation to Rachel, tore off her name tape and handed it back to the quartermaster. "I can't do this," she said, voice shaking. "I can't be part of a force that laughs at someone's face without hearing their story." Before anyone could stop her, she'd left. In the break room, her uniform hung on the hook like a surrender flag. Rachel Monroe learned of it only hours later via an internal email marked "Confidential Officer Separation." She read the single line, Monroe's resignation, and felt a fresh pang of guilt. One lost officer was a tragedy. Hundreds more threatened to walk away if the precinct didn't change. Late that afternoon, Monroe gathered her core team again. Now a skeleton crew of the willing and laid out a raw assessment trust was gone, and the public saw them as trigger-happy caricatures. Their only path forward was radical transparency. Publish stop reports online, invite third-party reviews, even allow body cam footage to be audited by civilian committees. She watched faces shift between shocked skepticism and grudging acceptance. "How do we restore faith?" she asked, voice softer now. "I don't know," one analyst whispered. Monroe leaned forward. "Then we begin by admitting we broke it. Then we show we can fix it." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the precinct's lights flickered on fluorescent and harsh against the gathering dusk. Officers trickled out of their cars, faces etched with fatigue and doubt. Monroe walked the rows of patrol vehicles, pausing at each window to catch a reflection. Hers tired but resolute, staring back amid the mess of hubcaps and musty leather seats. In the quiet that followed her rounds, she allowed herself one moment of grim reflection. They had always trained for scenarios of violence and chaos, but never for the stillness of being judged and found wanting by a man who refused to speak. Now the precinct itself was on trial, and the only verdict that would matter was the one written not in memos or hashtags, but in the slow rebuilding of trust with a badge yes, but above all, with actions. Tomorrow, she resolved, they would begin that work one transparent stop at a time. The morning sun slanted through the windows of Jefferson Elementary, casting golden pools of light across tiny desks strewn with crayons and notebooks. In Ms. Alvarez's third-grade classroom, the day's lesson began not with spelling, but with a question scrawled on the whiteboard in bold blue marker. "Can following the rules ever harm someone?" The children blinked, exchanging puzzled glances. It was a question they'd never been asked before, and for a moment silence ruled the room. Then little Amina raised her hand. Like if a police officer stops someone just because of how they look, she ventured, voice small but steady. Across the room, her classmate Ben frowned, remembering the viral video of Marcus Hayes, director of federal investigations, standing motionless in court as officers mocked him. He'd watched the clip with his father, who'd shaken his head and said, "That kind of behavior can hurt someone's heart." Now on this morning, those words took on new meaning. Miss Alvarez nodded. "Exactly," she said softly, moving to stand beside Amina's desk. "Sometimes following rules without thinking, just because they exist, can cause unintentional harm. Today we're going to talk about seeing the person, not just the rule." Down the street at Brew and Bond Cafe, barista Carmen Lopez wiped down the mahogany countertop, glancing at the framed image of Hayes in his crisp navy suit, once the face of a viral hashtag, now the emblem of quiet defiance. She hesitated before stepping out from behind the counter to ask the next customer, a weary commuter snagging a caramel latte. "And your name?" It felt different, almost tender, as though asking someone's name rather than crunching out "sir" or "ma'am" could bridge a chasm. Evan the man replied with a surprised smile. Carmen scribbled the name on the cup. Before it would have remained anonymous customer, Barber 42. Now each name was a small promise. This drink wasn't just a transaction, it was a chance to affirm someone's identity. Dignity intact. On corners and overpasses, local artisans sold tiny enamel pins shaped like the silver badge Hayes had revealed in that courtroom. Tourists and teenagers alike perked up when they saw them miniature director's insignias meant to provoke curiosity. "What's that?" a college student asked the vendor, tracing the badge's intricate etching. "It's Hayes's badge," the vendor answered. "A reminder that everyone deserves respect." The student slid a few bills across the table, clasped the pin to her backpack, and walked on with the weight of its meaning now resting lightly on her shoulder. Even the Department of Motor Vehicles got in on the movement. Drivers, renewing tags, were handed a sleek form stamped with a new prompt in bold italics. Did you make this person feel safe today? It replaced the bland checklist of boxes with something that stopped people mid-thought, a simple question explosively subversive in its insistence on empathy. Kara Nguyen, the DMV clerk, watched as the routine office buzz slowed to a hum of murmured reflection. A stooped retiree paused over the question pen hovering. "Feels safe," he muttered. Memory flickered when he was stopped once for weaving he'd felt humiliation before anything else. Now he wrote down no and handed the form back with eyes meeting hers. Kara offered a quiet nod of understanding, and the man perhaps for the first time left feeling seen. In local classrooms from elementary through community college, teachers rewrote lesson plans. History units on civil rights suddenly included the Hayes incident as a modern case study. It's not just about heroes of the past. Professor Collins told her undergraduates clipping a newspaper photo to the projector. Justice is alive today, and it asks each of us, will we stand silent or will we speak up? Her students scribbled notes, furiously pausing to discuss in small groups. How can we advocate for fairness in our own lives? What biases do we carry without noticing? The talk buzzed with urgency, a ripple of self-scrutiny sparked by one man's refusal to play along. City Hall installed a public comment kiosk in the main lobby, an interactive touchscreen asking visitors to respond to "Name one way you can foster trust in those who serve you." Answers scrolled in real time, a tapestry of resolve. Listen before judging. Learn about people's stories. Check my own assumptions. It looked less like a bureaucratic form and more like a collective vow. On the evening, news anchors dedicated segments to the Hayes effect, interviewing baristas, teachers, and even DMV clerks about the changes they'd seen. The tone was sober, reflective, no sensational headlines, but thoughtful dialogue. News desks displayed the question, what does true justice require of us? Everyday public call-ins rang in with personal confessions. I told my kid to think twice before telling a cop to prove himself. Meanwhile, local precincts rolled out new feeling safecards, laminated wallet-sized reminders that officers were encouraged to hand out when they conducted high-stress stops. Officer Patel from Monroe's unit said, "It's surprising how one question can calm a situation. Officer, do you feel safe?" can become, Officer, did I make you feel safe? The inversion prompted more mutual human connection than years of rote training. In one precinct break room, two officers watched a live stream of a community forum where Hayes himself spoke via video, urging listeners to pause, see the person before the procedure. Officer Davis, who once scoffed at the viral video, now quietly nodded. He's right, he admitted. We need to see the person, not the uniform. Within a week, even traffic patterns shifted. Drivers slowed at crosswalks, not because of flashing lights, but because signs now read, "Safety is a shared responsibility. Do you see the person behind the wheel?" Ghosted images of a human face overlaid on standard symbols prompted hard looks and softer deceleration. At City Hall's opening ceremony for a newly formed Civic Harmony Council, council members swapped hampers of community-sourced badges, small keepsakes symbolizing the Hayes ripple. One council member mid-speech paused to affix a badge to her lapel. We have learned, she said simply, that rules without empathy carve canyons between us. Today we choose to fill those spaces with understanding. By week's end, local bookstores stocked up on memoirs and journals lined beneath a hand-lettered sign, "Reflect your moral journey begins here." Diaries flew off the shelves as readers grappled with personal biases. One young woman leafed through pages she'd penned before the Hayes moment, shaking her head at earlier judgments. She opened a fresh notebook and wrote on the first page, "I will listen. I will reflect." Back at Jefferson Elementary, Ms. Alvarez closed her lesson with a prompt, "Draw a moment when someone chose empathy over assumption." Crayons scratched across paper as children depicted scenes of kindness, a girl helping a peer who stuttered, a boy letting an elderly neighbor cross the street. Their artwork overflowed the margins, a testament to the quiet revolution sparked by one man's stillness in a mocking courtroom. That afternoon in her car, Lieutenant, Rachel Monroe listened to a call-in on local radio. A teacher recounted how her class debated rules and respect. A Cajun couched asked officers to share stories of trust, and a retiree confessed his own biases, pledging to do better. Monroe closed her eyes briefly, wiping away a stray tear. The precinct turmoil of days past felt distant now, replaced by the soft murmur of a city reawakening to its better angels. As twilight settled over the skyline, the silver director's badge blinked on hundreds of keychains across town, tiny beacons of empathy clipped to belts and backpacks. Monroe reached into her pocket, touched the badge she'd received at the Awareness Summit, and whispered, "Thank you, Marcus Hayes." In the grand sweep of history, perhaps it would be cataloged as a footnote, but in the everyday rhythms of life, it had become an anthem, small acts of seeing, small acts of care, rippling outward until no corner of the city remained untouched. And in that shared consciousness, the quiet defiance of one man had become the catalyst for 1,000 moments of true human connection. Morning light filtered through the honey-tinted blinds of the Federal Liaison Office, painting long, angular shadows across the polished mahogany table. The air was cool, laced with the faint scent of old leather-bound files and fresh coffee. Lieutenant Rachel Monroe perched at one end, shoulders squared but eyes betraying a flicker of nervous anticipation. Across from her sat Marcus Hayes, unflinching, composed as though he were seated in his own living room rather than the nerve center of interagency oversight. A single unmarked envelope rested between them, the paper so crisp it caught the light in a subtle gleam. Hayes's fingertips hovered above its flap, as if pausing to acknowledge the gravity of what lay inside. Monroe's breath caught in her throat. In that quiet moment, the weight of every mocking laugh, every grudging concession to Hayes's dignity pressed upon her. All the precinct's turmoil, the closed-door briefings, the memos admonishing officers to know. Before you judge, the grassroots ripple of empathy, sweeping the city led here to this chill oak-lined chamber, where truth would break through like a shaft of sunlight. Hayes placed one hand on the envelope's edge. His fingers were steady, practiced an echo of every patient moment he'd sat in that courtroom, refusing to play the part he'd been offered. Monroe felt a surge of guilt for the flicker of triumph some officers had allowed themselves when they thought his silence signaled weakness. Now she realized that very silence was his greatest negotiation. With deliberate calm, Hayes slit the flap. Inside lay a single cardstock credential embossed in silver lettering, Jonathan Pierce, Director of National Investigations, Federal Bureau of Accord. He lifted it from the envelope and held it at eye level, the badge's mirror finish catching the room's muted light. He turned it slowly as though charging the moment with both revelation and quiet vindication. Monroe's hand flew to her mouth. The breath she'd been holding spilled out in a soft gasp. She looked from the badge to Hayes's face, still serene, almost regal, and back again. There was no embellishment, no grand proclamation. The badge spoke volumes on its own. It named him not as a defendant, nor as a lawyer pleading his case, but as the very architect of investigations she had once believed to be beyond reproach. Hayes set the badge gently on the table, its silver sheen now etched into Monroe's vision. She reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly, and brushed her thumb over the engraved letters. In that instant, every scornful joke he had weathered, every whispered, "He thinks he's someone special," transformed into a testament of his unspoken authority. Laughter in the precinct, once a weapon, lay dissolved in the hush of revelation. He spoke then, his voice low and measured, filling the space between them. "I hope this clears up any misunderstandings about my identity." There was no scorn in his tone, only a quiet insistence that she, like everyone else, reconcile her assumptions with the truth. Monroe swallowed, steadying her voice. "Director Pierce," she said, eyes locking onto his eye, but words failed her. How could she apologize for the echo of every misstep made by officers who treated him like a common suspect? How could she assure him that the reforms sweeping through the city were more than performative gestures? He inclined his head slightly, as if reading her inner struggle. "Lieutenant Monroe, the changes I've witnessed." He gestured to the slips of altered forms, the classroom murals, the tiny badges now worn citywide. "They speak louder than any statement I could make. I won't waste time demanding apologies. I only wanted you to know who I am." Monroe exhaled, her shoulders dropping as though weight had been lifted. Your restraint, she found herself saying, voice thick with emotion, has been the catalyst for all of this. I can't imagine what it took to stay silent under such ridicule and then to reveal yourself now so unsparingly. Hayes allowed a faint knowing smile. Sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that speaks only when it matters. He slid the badge across the table toward her, not as a gift, but as a symbol. Hold it. Remind yourself that every person you encounter deserves to be known before they're judged. Monroe let the badge rest against her palm, its weight a silent vow. Outside the tinted windows, she could almost hear the distant hum of a city waking to the possibilities he'd ignited. New policies, fresh conversations, the slow but undeniable shift of hearts and minds. They sat in thoughtful silence for a long moment. The hum of the ventilation system and the ticking of a wall clock were the only sounds, yet neither felt intrusive. Instead, they underscored the gravity of what had just transpired, a baptism of truth in a space too long conditioned to accept easy narratives. Finally, Monroe spoke again. What happens next? The words were simple, but her tone carried the weight of her entire department and of the community that had rallied around this moment. Hayes leaned back, hands folded in his lap. For a heartbeat, his gaze drifted toward the window, as if envisioning the horizon of change. Now, he said, we ensure this isn't merely a moment, but a movement. You and I both know that policies can be written, forms can be redesigned, badges can be redistributed. His eyes met hers again, unwavering. But real progress demands vigilance. It demands that every officer, every citizen commit to asking, before every interaction, have I seen the person standing before me? Monroe nodded, a fierce resolve glowing in her eyes. I'll hold every precinct to that standard, she promised. Starting now. She blinked back a tear she hadn't realized had formed. Thank you, Director Pierce. He inclined his head once more, a subtle salute to a shared mission. Thank you, Lieutenant, he replied. As he rose, Monroe offered him the envelope that had carried his credentials. Instead, he gently guided it aside. Keep it, he said. Let it remind us both that authority means little without humility. Monroe slid the badge back into the envelope, closing the flap with respectful care. She placed it in her breast pocket right over where her heart would sit. In that space between badge and bone lay the promise of renewed purpose. Hayes stood straightening his jacket. For a fleeting moment, lit by the glow of revelation, he appeared almost larger than life, an unspoken declaration that justice, like all power, finds its noblest form in service to others. Monroe rose as well, stepping around the table to shake his hand. Their grip was firm, a covenant forged not in flashbulbs or headlines, but in the silent acknowledgement of shared humanity. He departed the office with that same calm confidence he'd carried into the courtroom weeks before leaving Monroe alone with the sealed envelope in her pocket and the enormity of what it represented. The sunlight had shifted. Now the room was awash in mid-morning glow, hopeful and clear. Lieutenant Monroe pressed her hand over her heart, felt the badge's outline beneath her uniform. The laughter that once echoed in derision had been replaced by the sacred hush of recognition, and in that stillness lay the true power of one man's refusal to be anything less than himself. The reveal was complete, and the city he'd touched would never be the same. The courtroom felt suspended in midair as though the very rafters had forgotten their purpose. Light slanted in through high-set windows, tracing dust motes that danced between benches and pulpit. Officer Jackson Ballard stood by the defense table, uniform crisp, but shoulders slumped, name tag glinting under the harsh ceiling lamps. In front of him, Judge Eliza Carrington Gavel, poised but unmoving, watched Marcus Hayes unfold the silver badge for a second time as though it were sacred scripture demanding readers rethink every line they'd already read. Ballard's mouth went dry. He'd once believed the law was a sealed book, its chapters unchangeable and its verdicts beyond reproach. Now every promise he'd ever whispered to himself, I knew what I was doing, crumpled under Hayes's quiet revelation. He swallowed hard and glanced at the jury box. Faces that had glowered at Hayes only minutes before now stared back in stunned disbelief, a mix of shock, guilt, and that primal fear of having been on the wrong side of a story they thought they'd already written. Judge Carrington's gavel hovered midair as though waiting for her to decide whether to end a sentence or start a prayer. The courtroom's script had dissolved. No one knew what came next. The charge sheet lay atop her bench, indicting Hayes for obstruction and resisting arrest words now rendered absurd. The pleas murmured by the bailiff. "Has the defendant anything to say?" echoed hollowly. Hayes silent as stone. Throughout the original proceedings, now sat back in his chair, calm and unhurried. His calmness was the only anchor in the chaos. Ballard's partner, Detective Rowan Price, shuffled papers behind the prosecution's table. He'd been the one to watch Hayes's entrance earlier, sharp suit, immaculate stride measured. He'd cracked a joke, an offhand, ill-considered jab about slicked-back suit and no charm. Now watching Hayes lean forward, gaze direct yet non-threatening, Price felt every word he'd uttered recoil in on itself. His throat tightened. He found himself unable to look away. A woman in the public gallery, a social worker named Carmen Lee, rose to her feet, heart hammering. She'd come to observe to remind herself why she'd chosen a career built on compassion. She'd watched the officer's laughter, felt her own pulse rate quicken with discomfort, but had hesitated to speak. Now with the badge gleaming in Hayes's hand, she realized the burden of unspoken witness. Everything she'd seen today, the scoffing smirks, the mocking TikToks, had formed a record more damning than any body cam footage. Judge Carrington cleared her throat, a soft sound that rippled across the stunned hush. "Officer Ballard," she said, voice wry and weary, "would you care to explain to the court why you arrested the Director of National Investigations on a whim?" Her words were steady, but carried the weight of betrayal of having believed in a procedural world now revealed as perilously fragile. Ballard's knees felt weak. The crowd pressed its collective gaze upon him. He wanted to speak the truth. He wanted to confess his own biases, the twitch of prejudice that had guided his flashlight and his cuffs. But the words lodged in his throat. Instead, he lifted his chin and managed, "Your Honor." There was confusion in the field, a report of suspicious behavior that matched Mr. Hayes's description. "We followed protocol." The word tasted bitter. Price inhaled frustration coiling in his chest. He stood suddenly, papers fluttering to the floor. "With all due respect." "Your Honor," he said, voice trembling. "Protocol doesn't permit us to arrest someone because they dress sharply or walk calmly. That's profiling." Heat bloomed in his cheeks as cameras clicked. He'd spoken a truth that cut through the court's remaining veneer of order. Hayes inclined his head, as though allowing Price's admission to settle into the room's air before he spoke. "Officer Price," he said quietly, "what matters more, procedure or persons? Because a law enforced without recognizing the humanity of those it affects is no law at all." His words landed like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples through every mind present. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Judge Carrington nodded slowly, gavel lowering but not striking. "We seem to have lost our footing," she said. "This trial? No. This proceeding demands a new beginning, not a performance written by fear or prejudice, but a dialogue grounded in truth." She set the gavel aside. "Mr. Hayes, you may stand." Hayes' rose badge gleaming now against his chest. Every eye followed his ascent, not as a spectacle, but as a revelation. Ballard felt a lump in his throat as Hayes turned to address the courtroom prosecutor's defense counsel, the gallery, every officer and clerk. "I did not come to this court seeking vengeance," Hayes began, tone ringing with quiet authority. "I came seeking justice that recognizes each person's worth before it demands their compliance. You have the right to bear arms. They also bear responsibility. Your badges oblige you to see those you serve, not merely to see that they obey." A murmur spread among the spectators. The toddler whose innocent question, "Is he a bad guy?" had been mocked, now sat clutching her mother's hand, wide eyes tracing Hayes's calm presence. The mother held back tears. Ballard recognized her. She'd been in the hallway outside, voice trembling in protest. Now they exchanged a look, a shared acknowledgement of having been on the verge of something dark, and now of witnessing something redemptive. The bailiff, unsure whether to proceed with the indictment, remained silent. The prosecution team, once eager for conviction, exchanged glances heavy with regret. Even the stenographer's fingers stilled above her keyboard. Tick, tick, tick. The court's machinery, built on scripted turns and formal declarations, now paused to catch its breath. Hayes closed his eyes for a moment, as though composing his next thought off stage. Then he spoke again, softer this time. "I do not ask that you ignore the letter of the law. I only ask that you remember the spirit it was written to uphold the dignity of every person on every corner in every courtroom, regardless of their station or our assumptions about them." There was an elegance in his restraint, a refusal to jeer back, to demand retribution, or to stage a grand exit. He simply stood still as a tree in winter branches, bare but unbowed. The courtroom leaned in, unlearning its own rhythms. Silence replaced the gavel, more potent than any sentence. No convict stood in a cage. No jury delivered a foregone verdict. Instead, every soul there faced the weight of its own complicity and the opportunity to begin again. Ballard moved first. He stepped forward, badge jangling. "Your Honor," he said, voice firmer, "now I withdraw the charges. This trial has no warrant." The words were spoken for the court record, but they felt like baptism, a cleansing of errors past an admission that law enforcement could err when it forgot the human at the heart of every case. Price followed, clearing his throat. "I second that motion, Your Honor." His gaze met Ballard's in a nod of solidarity. A silent pact to do better to police not only others, but themselves. Judge Carrington rose from her bench. The judge's robes, once symbols of distant authority, now seemed a reminder of shared responsibility. She looked out over the courtroom and raised her hand, not to strike the gavel, but to still the room. So ordered, she pronounced, voice gentle yet unbreakable. A breath exhaled collectively. Ballard felt his shoulders dip, tension draining. Around him, people exhaled too, witnesses, staff, even the courtroom's ancient wood. The verdict was not on paper. It was written in the trembling relief, the unclenched hands, the sobs held back, and the glances exchanged. Hayes inclined his head in thanks and stepped past Ballard toward the exit. Ballard watched him go, every stride embodying the dignity that had been denied him. Outside, the world waited, press corps cameras at the door, a sea of faces eager for headlines. Hayes would meet them, but not with rage or triumph, perhaps with a single measured statement that justice demands both courage and compassion. Inside, Ballard knelt to retrieve Price's dropped papers and offered them with a nod. No one needed applause. They needed only to remember this moment, a trial, without a script. A courtroom reborn in silence, and the promise that the next chapter would be written not by fear, but by seeing one another as fully human. Morning broke under a slate-gray sky, its pale light diffused through low-hanging clouds that clung like quiet conspirators to the city's towers. At precinct stations across the state, the first shift of officers arrived to their desks only to find their computer screens drenched in crimson alerts. Keycard scanners, once obediently humming in welcoming green, now pulsed red, denying entry to every hallway, every locker room, every evidence vault. The systems they'd taken for granted had turned on them overnight. Detective Rowan Price was the first to notice. He swept into his office, oversized mug of strong coffee in hand, and swiped through the scanner at the door. The reader swallowed his badge without hesitation, its red glow mocking his years of service. His brow furrowed. He tapped the scanner again, heart picking up a staccato rhythm. No green light came. Confusion rippled through him until a system message blazed across his terminal: user privileges, suspended pending federal review. He slammed his coffee down, acrid steam rising in protest. Muffled footsteps sounded behind him. Sergeant Lydia Moreno rounded the corner, phone pressed to her ear. She swore softly, cut the call short, and met his wide-eyed stare. "You see this?" she asked, voice taut. He nodded, pointing to a screen. She opened her phone and scanned the precinct-wide group chat lines of frantic messages, all the same encrypted directives, seal codes, immediate federal oversight, do not override. Across the hall, patrol officers hovering over the radio listened to dispatchers repeat a single extraordinary broadcast. Effective immediately, all arrest records stop. Logs and body-worn camera archives are under federal review. Local systems locked. Any attempt to access or modify records will be flagged as non-compliance. The dispatcher's calm tone made the words all the more surreal. Officer Jackson Ballard trudged into the break room, greeted by an array of blinking red tabs on his laptop. He closed his eyes. A low hum of disquiet rippled through the squad. They were cut off no access to databases that housed years of case files and investigations. Policies that had seemed eternal were now malleable scripts written by a different hand. Far above the precinct in a nondescript federal liaison office, Jonathan Pierce watched satellite feeds of the fallout. He sipped lukewarm tea and let the tension flow through his fingertips as he watched precinct after precinct fall silent on their own equipment. There had been no press release, no dramatic announcement. The operation had moved in the shadows of policy executed by lines of code rather than cavalry, yet its impact was absolute. In the precinct's main bullpen, phones rang unanswered. Young officers hovered by the scanners, leaning in as though to persuade the machine by sheer will. Administrative assistants shuffled papers, their usual tasks rendered meaningless without system access. The hum of fluorescent lights seemed to crackle with latent energy. Detective Price rallied his core team. "All right, listen up," he began, voice steady but urgent. "We've got a direct order from D.C. It's not negotiable. Every record you have from parking tickets to homicide files is locked. We wait for instruction." He swallowed. "And we pray we get it soon. Because right now, we're blind." Across town at the county jail, officers found themselves unable to view intake forms or update custody logs. Detainees, some scheduled for release, waited as booking computers refused to print paperwork. A flurry of whispered debates erupted. What do we do with them? Hold them indefinitely. The question hung in the stale air, uncomfortably unanswered. Lieutenant Rachel Monroe paced in her office, earbuds and listening to the hum of distant sirens. She clenched her jaw and slid her finger over her phone's screen. Lawyers and community leaders had already begun to circle, smelling a scandal ripe for exploitation. Social media posts multiplied by the hour. Federal sweep hits local cops' hair of the dog that bit them. Director Pierce flexes on precinct suits. Monroe scrolled through each new tweet, each fresh meme, none sympathetic, all gleeful. But beneath the mockery, something else stirred. A grudging respect even among those who had never thought beyond their own jurisdiction. For the first time in decades, they felt the tectonic plates of authority shift beneath their feet. No gunshots had rung out. No riot shields had been deployed. Yet orders more powerful than any baton had reshaped the landscape. At 0400 hours, federal liaisons arrived at select precincts, silent emissaries in dark suits carrying nothing more than encrypted tablets and clipped badges. They moved through the corridors like ghosts slipping into server rooms and keycard panels. Their presence was felt rather than heard, a whispered instruction, here, a locked console there. And then they were gone, leaving behind a trail of stunned officers. Upstairs in the precinct chief's office, Chief Howard Reeves stared at his phone's screen with bleary eyes. A single message blinked, "Contact Federal Liaison immediately. Failure to comply will result in further enforcement." He had no choice but to comply. He dialed the liaison number, voice subdued. 3 rings, then silence, then a click. Chief Reeves, the calm voice on the other end, said, "We have your briefing at 0600. Be prompt." Dawn's gray fingers reached into every precinct, laying bare vulnerabilities long hidden behind badges and dispatch radios. There was no public fanfare, no banners announcing a new era. Instead, the quiet reprogramming of trust local officers had to defer to a federal presence they had branded themselves. In the break room, Ballard and Price tracked the broader picture on their phones. Reports trickled in from neighboring counties, the same red flashes, the same whispers of oversight. "They've got the whole state locked," Price muttered. His profile, his phone logs, his every digital move was now subject to federal scrutiny. He realized he was no longer policing his community. He'd become part of the subject under investigation. Meanwhile, Pierce's office hummed with purpose. His hand hovered over the final command prompt, ready to authorize phased reopenings of critical systems, but only after compliance protocols were certified. He watched the data feed from each precinct, compliance rates, override attempts, unauthorized access flags. Every bit of data offered him real-time proof of the experiment's reach. Somewhere in an empty evidence locker, Logan Carter, the precinct's IT specialist, sat alone, monitors casting a pale glow across his worried face. He tapped commands to isolate local backups to prevent any renegade attempts to restore access. He had been told expressly, no back doors, no workarounds. He would become the first to alert federal liaisons if he saw anything amiss. His loyalty, now divided, lay with the new architects of authority. By mid-morning, precinct bulletin boards displayed hastily printed notices. All inquiries about record access must be referred to Federal Liaison Office 202-5501-223. Community outreach teams assembled to rebuild trust after the Hayes incident now had a new mission: reassure the public that policing was still intact even as its foundations lay under federal review. And yet in the hushed corners of station hallways, conversations hinted at relief as well as fear. Junior officers, previously suffocated by draconian quotas and performance metrics, felt a strange lightness. For once, they did not need to worry about trivial audits or tick-box compliance. Their days of playing internal politics had been paused by a power they could not contest. Lieutenant Monroe found herself oddly grateful, though she would never admit it. The federal strike had forced the entire force to confront its own shortcomings. It was a reckoning more profound than any internal memo or diversity training ever could be, because it came with real consequences. Locked files, professional uncertainty, the lingering uncertainty that authority could be stripped in the silence of code. As afternoon light filtered through blinds, Jackson Ballard made his way outside for a breath of air. He paused under the precinct's flagpole, where the emblem of local justice fluttered in a wind tinged with cold. He raised his eyes to the flag and thought of Marcus Hayes, of the director who had sat before them in silence unbowed. He recalled Hayes's measured words, "Law must see people, not merely demand compliance." Ballard traced the red glow of his dead scanner in his mind, the echo of encrypted directives that had upended every assumption he'd ever held. He felt the weight of accountability stretching far beyond handcuffs and case files. He sensed that this federal strike, this unseen realignment of power, was not a temporary storm, but the first tremor of a deeper shift in how justice would be enforced and how it would be earned. In every precinct, from the gleaming metropolis downtown to the weathered stations in outlying towns, officers stood at the crossroads of obedience and introspection. Their systems, once pillars of certainty, now reminded them that authority was never absolute, only conditional, fragile, and dependent on the very people it served. And at the heart of this transformation stood a man who had come to court in a suit as sharp as any blade, whose silence had cleaved open their prejudices, and whose badge now governed their actions from the shadows of encrypted command. As dusk approached and the red scanners finally yielded to controlled, monitored access, restored in phases, officers felt the residue of that dawn's disruption settle in their bones. The precinct had survived the federal strike, but it would never be the same. The authority they once wielded with blind certainty had been reprogrammed, its pulse measured not by local pride, but by coded oversight. And every officer who returned to duty carried a new awareness that justice-like power could shift on a whisper of directives and the quiet resolve of a single badge. Morning light filtered through the slatted blinds of a secure federal conference room, casting narrow beams of brightness across glossy documents strewn over a long oak table. Agent Maya Liu sat at the far end, her fingertips tracing circle patterns on a manila folder stamped "Top Secret." Across from her, Dr. Alan Rodriguez, a behavioral analyst contracted to the experiment, leaned forward, eyes alight with a grim satisfaction. "It's all here," he murmured, lifting the report's cover sheet. 3 years of footage, 3 years of data. Every nuance captured. Outside the glass partition, the hallway was silent, an oversized vault protecting the truth within. Liu opened the folder, revealing grainy stills. Officer Ballard's smirk as he prodded Director Pierce's elbow. A clerk's hidden cell phone lens recording Hayes' silent entrance, a patrolman's mocking hand over his mouth. Beside each image, charts plotted heart rate spikes, cortisol readings, pupil dilation. The experiment's bones lay naked on the table. Liu flipped a page. "They didn't see it coming," she said softly. Her voice echoed in the hush as though the walls themselves leaned closer. For them, it was just another stop. "But you and I know it was engineered." Pierce set the stage. Rodriguez nodded. "He did more than stage a scene. He gave us a mirror." He tapped the page where a graph spiked in unison with a TikTok remix of Hayes striding into the courtroom. "See this?" At 14:23, when the music hits, laughter erupts. And look how groupthink amplifies it. The average stress level jumps 30% across the board. Across town in a nondescript newsroom, investigative reporter Serena Caldwell watched her screen. A secure file transfer had just landed in her inbox, a folder labeled Project Mirror, Do Not Disclose. She clicked through, heart pounding. Leaked slides revealed the experiment's methodology, clandestine cameras placed in blind spots, biometric scanners tuned to detect micro-expressions, encrypted logs of every officer's smartphone metadata. Caldwell's mind raced. "This is it," she whispered to herself. "This is the real story." Her editor, Marcus Taylor, hovered behind her. "What have you got?" he asked. Without looking up, she handed him the keyboard. Everything she said. They weren't just monitoring, they were conducting a national moral audit on us. Taylor's eyebrows shot up. On the public? He read a slide: objective, elicit, and measure unconscious bias under non-intervention conditions. He exhaled slowly. They used us as lab rats. Back in the federal conference room, Liu and Rodriguez regrouped. "Serena Caldwell is about to publish," Liu said, checking her secure line. Rodriguez frowned. That could blow the operation wide open. He reached for his coffee, set it down with a delicate clink. Or it could force society to confront what we already know the system is built on: seeing people, not humanity. In the Capitol building's press gallery, Caldwell stepped to the podium, folders of evidence in hand. Reporters from every major outlet waited, pens poised. Today, she began, voice steady, "We unveil Project Mirror, an unprecedented 3-year federal study in which a single individual's silent presence became the catalyst for revealing the nation's hidden biases." She let the words hang, watching the room shift. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as she projected stills of the courtroom analytics graphs and the emblematic image of Hayes revealing his badge. In precinct stations, televisions flickered as news anchors recapped the revelation. Lieutenant Monroe, surrounded by her lieutenants, absently turned the volume down. The words "ethical exposure experiment" echoed through the speakers. She looked at the wall of monitors showing social media reactions. Some hailed Pierce's ingenuity, others howled betrayal. Monroe's jaw tightened. So it wasn't just about one arrest, she said. It was an orchestrated wake-up call. At the Community Justice Center, Jamal West, once a defendant, now an advisor, watched the live stream with Maria Hernandez and Dr. Carter. Maria's lip quivered. They recorded everything she whispered, every snicker, every tweet. Dr. Carter nodded. "But now we have the evidence to demand systemic change." West turned from the screen and addressed the group. "We knew prejudice was real," he said, voice resonant. "But seeing it mapped in black and white, that's our power. We confront it, we dismantle it." Meanwhile, in a hushed wing of the Justice Department, Attorney General Eliza Marsh reviewed a thick dossier. She tapped her pen against the desk, eyes fixed on the digital playback of Pierce's silent vigil. She closed the file and spoke into a secure line. "We proceed with the grand jury. We hold hearings on federal oversight. It's time to legislate the lessons learned." Her hand hovered over a red authorize button for a moment, as though weighing the gravity of enshrining moral experiments into law. Back in the quiet of his home office, Pierce watched the fallout with measured calm. He scrolled through interviews, some praising him as a visionary, others denouncing him as a manipulator of public trust. He closed his laptop and looked at the badge on his desk. Its silver surface caught the lamplight, reflecting his face in miniature. No words accompanied that reflection. Silence was the final commentary. In police academies, nationwide cadets gathered around screens, replaying the infamous courtroom footage. Instructors paused the video at each moment of bias exposure, the toddler's innocent query twisted into mockery, the clerk's hidden camera lens, the body cam edits meant to discredit. They stood in near silence, absorbing both the actions and the reactions. Then an instructor spoke, voice low. "This is your mirror. We expect better." At a late-night think tank gathering, policy wonks and ethicists dissected leaked memos. One consultant noted, "The behavioral models align with predictive policing algorithms, but here prediction turned inward. The system studied itself." Another added, "It's a blueprint for future oversight, but also a caution. Power must not forget the human at the center." And on social media, as the mirror of conscience trended, ordinary users posted apologies for past mockeries, sharing personal stories of unexamined bias. One viral thread read, "I laughed at that video. Today I'm donating to a civil rights fund. Another read, I'm emailing my mayor about body cam transparency. A third, this made me confront my own blind spots. In the end, the experiment's true impact lay not in the cameras or the data, but in the collective pause it forced a moment when an entire nation looked into the mirror and saw itself. Pierce's silent testament had exposed more than individual wrongdoing. It laid bare the structures of assumption, urging every viewer to reckon with their role in the story. And although the cameras might have turned off, the reflections they captured would continue to ripple, guiding the long journey from awareness to accountability. Months later, the corridors of the FBI Academy at Quantico lay hushed under fluorescent lights, their buzz softened to a distant hum. Keycard locks glowed in muted red, admitting only those summoned. Agent Clara Reeves stepped off the elevator onto the third-floor landing, adjusting the strap of her satchel. She paused to smooth the front of her blazer, though she knew her reflection in the polished glass door bore no sign of nerves, only the taut anticipation she felt ripple through the other attendees milling just beyond. Inside the unmarked lecture hall, rows of black mesh chairs faced a raised dais, its only adornment a solitary microphone on a slender stand. No banner, no placard, just a blank projection screen that waited like a promise. Reeves found her seat in the fourth row, flanked by a mix of senior agents in crisp suits and younger recruits in pressed slacks. Murmurs fell silent as the last guest arrived, Jonathan Pierce. He emerged from a back corridor without flourish. His charcoal suit was immaculate, his posture unassuming yet undeniably measured. There was no escort, no drumroll, only the sliding of the thick wooden door and the soft shuffle of footsteps on carpet. Reeves felt a collective intake of breath as though the room itself paused to register his presence. She watched his hand rise in a brief nod to the officials standing in the wings, then seat himself in an unmarked chair at the far left of the dais. No introduction was offered. The symposium's chairman had vanished as though Pierce's arrival had preempted any need for formality. A hush enveloped the room, an expectant silence more powerful than applause. Reeves inhaled, tasting the tension that danced on the stale edge of recycled air. Somewhere in the darkness behind her, a recruit's knuckles whitened around a notepad. Somebody's pen clicked. The only sound was the distant echo of Reeves's own heartbeat thumping in her ears, like a rehearsal of what was to come. After what felt like an eternity, the lights dimmed slightly and a single spotlight found Pierce's empty chair. He rose without prompting and crossed to the microphone, each step soft but deliberate. Reeves noted the slight crease at the corner of his suit jacket, the way his shoes caught a sliver of light as he pivoted toward the audience. He paused, hands clasped before him, not touching the stand, not gripping it, simply existing in that measured silence. Then almost imperceptibly, he tapped the microphone once. No feedback squeal, no crackle, just the tiniest pulse of sound that commanded attention. Reeves straightened, pressing her palms against her thighs. Even the recruits in the back rows leaned forward. Pierce inhaled. His eyes swept the faces before him, not in search of approval, but in quiet acknowledgement of shared purpose. Time seemed to stretch as he stood there, then exhaled softly, and spoke voice low, but carrying effortlessly to every corner of the hall. I came to see the system reflect. That was it. 7 words. No flourish, no follow-up. 7 syllables that hung like a suspended verdict in the charged air. Reeves felt the words resonate inside her like the toll of a bell in a cathedral. Judges, directors, agents, every person in that room recognized the weight of what had been said. The silence stretched on, forbidden from breaking. No questions erupted, no hurried shuffling of feet. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. Reeves realized she could hear her own pulse again, yet it felt as though the entire building's heartbeat had slowed to match hers. In the stillness, she saw more than Pierce's shadow on the blank screen. She saw the cumulative gaze of every officer who had ever donned a badge, every analyst who had pored over data, every recruit sworn in with eager optimism. Reflect was not simply a verb. It was a mandate. Look inward. See yourself in the mirror of your own actions, confront the biases and blind spots that no policy could fully erase. A single woman in this front row, a decorated agent known for her steely resolve, folded her arms, eyes gleaming with unspoken understanding. 2 seats down, a young tech specialist dabbed at moist palms as if he'd stepped through a thunderstorm. Reeves glanced around and noticed tears glinting on the cheek of an academy instructor, a man whose stern lessons had shaped generations of agents. He blinked rapidly, perhaps feeling the silent verdict more viscerally than any spoken judgment could deliver. Minutes passed. The only movement was Pierce's subtle lowering of his head as though concluding a prayer. Reeves fought the urge to exhale. She imagined the gavel of that earlier courtroom where silence had become a living sentence. Here now, silence was a revelation, a collective epiphany that needed neither spectacle nor ceremony. Finally, Reeves felt the room exhale as one. Her own breath came easier, though her chest still ached with the gravity of those 7 words. A smattering of applause began tentative at first, then more confident, as though each clap was a promise to live up to the call. Pierce remained still at the microphone, eyes closed briefly, as if offering gratitude to the silence itself. Reeves rose from her seat, joining the wave of standing ovation that swept the room. Yet even as she joined in, she felt the resolve settle deeper than any round of applause. Pierce's command to reflect would not fade with the lights or the echo of applause. It would pulse through every policy review, every training exercise, every adjudication of use of force. As the audience began to file out, agents grouping into hushed clusters, exchanging glances of renewed purpose, Reeves lingered. She watched Pierce step away from the podium, returning to his unmarked chair, now bathed in a softer light. There was no fanfare, no entourage. Just a man who had spoken a simple truth and allowed the silence that followed to become the loudest statement of all. She approached his seat, lowering her voice. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt inadequate. Pierce looked up, offering a small, wry smile that seemed to convey mutual acknowledgement. The fight for justice begins not with grand speeches, but with the courage to be still and see ourselves clearly. Reeves turned to leave with a final glance. Behind her in the empty lecture hall, the microphone stood silent, no longer a tool of address, but a symbol of the power that lies in restraint. And as the door clicked shut, sealing Pierce's solitary silhouette against the darkened dais, the hall remained suspended in its own reflection, bound by the quiet verdict that had already begun to reshape every mind that had witnessed it.